Namaste. Welcome to Chiti Media. I am Kamal Madi Shetty, your host for today. On our show today, we are going to discuss some very important subjects. The violence in Leicester in the United Kingdom a few weeks ago, and more generally, rising Islamism in the UK. Why is it happening? Who's enabling it? And what can be done to counter it? And joining me on our show today is a very special guest from the UK, Wasiq Wasiq ji. Wasiq ji is an academic and writer who has an expertise in extremism and terrorism. He works as an associate research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society in the UK. Namaste, Wasiq ji. Welcome to Chiti Media.
Namaste.
Thank you, Wasiq ji, for joining us on our show today. Wasiq ji, a few weeks ago, we saw some very disturbing visuals coming out of Leicester and a few other places in the UK where Hindus and Hindu temples in particular were attacked. Now, for the benefit of our viewers, Wasiq ji, some of whom may not have followed the events the way they unfolded, you as someone who lives in the UK, could you please share with our viewers what exactly happened in Leicester a few weeks ago that led to the kind of violence that we saw?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Kamalji, for having me on. Thank you for the team at Chitti Media for organising this, and I really hope that your audience get a fruitful discussion from us and to cover some of the topics that perhaps you don't necessarily get to do in depth. Now, in terms of what really happened in Leicester, I think there is a caveat that I would like to make, and that's that I don't know all of the facts. And if I don't know all of the facts, there are other people who also don't know all of the facts. But there are some things that we can say for certain that happened. Now, one of the first things that I'd like to discuss is that there is a lot of talk of a Muslim man being apparently violently assaulted in May by a group of Hindu men. And this may or may not be true, but there are individuals that are pushing this narrative. Now, in my view, they are doing this to prove that what subsequently happened had its origins in community tensions between Muslims and Hindus. So when we saw all of those violent clashes between, or in fact, well, at least it seems to be orchestrated by groups of Islamist men against Hindus, then we need to look at the etiology of this, the origins of this. So that's one of the sparks that led to this. So what the narrative is that there was a lot of fuel there already and it just needed a spark. But after that May event, nothing happened. Nothing happened until India beat Pakistan in the cricket. And naturally, when we see these sorts of things happen, people in their droves come out to celebrate. People have laddu, they have jalebi, and even a bit of alcohol. Now, this is quite normal in the UK, especially after a sporting match. You only have to look at how football fans celebrate in their local in our language here in Britain is what we refer to as a public house, where people go to have a drink and have a good time and socialize with their friends. And they do this after winning a game. But of course, there are implications to this, and some will drink too much and they will misbehave. Now, this happens, and it's normal. It's not right, but it's a normal occurrence. So obviously, when scuffles take place and things can escalate and get out of hand, that's a shame, of course, but it does happen, and it did happen. And we saw videos of an individual who had drank too much and then, was causing a lot of trouble when people were misbehaving. Now, this resulted in people nowadays taking their smartphones, recording it, and then sharing it in WhatsApp groups and some media and so on and so forth. And as a result of that, lots of misinformation is then distributed amongst networks of people, whether it's your network of aunties or Islamist networks or the so-called Hindutva networks. These things happen. And when misinformation is being propagated and not challenged, people tend to believe it. And as a result of this, was being narrated by some of these people, these extremists, was that a Muslim man was being attacked by Hindus or Indians. It was Indians primarily at that time. And people tend to then believe this because no one's challenging it. And this becomes into a conspiracy theory. And there's a reason why people believe in conspiracy theories, such as this or any others, is because there is an epistemic need that drives their consuming for unverified news. The reason why they do this is because they no longer believe in mainstream media reporting of it, or even people of authority giving it, because they don't trust them anymore. So they want to take control of an internal narrative. And this was one of the reasons why all of these things were being shared so frequently, and lots of people were picking this narrative and believing it. Because at the end of the day, at that time, a lot of people weren't believing verified reports. So we heard of a Muslim man being stabbed. We also heard of an attempted kidnap of a Muslim girl, again by apparently Indians or Hindus. But yet, according to the police, none of this had actually been happening. However, what was happening was temples were being vandalized, Hindus were being harassed. This crucial point here is that balance here isn't required. I'm not here to give balance to something. I'm here to give objective facts. And we know that there is one objective fact here, is that the police confirmed that none of these things had happened. But remember, when it comes to conspiracy theories, it doesn't matter anymore, because the police had no standing with the community at the time in that sense, and so people just didn't care. Particularly, also even on social media, they didn't care that the police were saying these things didn't happen. They just wanted to ensure that whatever they were consuming was confirming a belief in them that they were being attacked. And when I talk about these people, I'm talking about the Islamists here. For them, they needed to believe that they were under attack, and there needed to be an enemy that was attacking them. And for them, the enemy was, of course, the Hindutva. But what is interesting about this is that what normally would have been just a normal ruckus, a ruckus meaning a fight between people from the subcontinent, whether it's Pakistan or India, this was now turning into a religious thing. Remember that what happened was a cricket match between Pakistan and India, not a cricket match between Muslims and Hindus. That is really important here. But it turned into a religious conflict. And in my view, it turned into a religious conflict because Islamists were coming out into their droves, both in Leicester and from outside of Leicester, to whip up this frenzy against the Hindutva threat that they now were presenting by everyone. And we saw this so clearly when the saffron flag was taken down by an individual who, in my view, could only have been an Islamist when he was there protesting with all the other Islamists outside of that Hindu temple. Nothing seemed to be done about that. Then also we saw in Smethwick, again, a bunch of Islamists went over there deliberately to target a Hindu temple because they had invited a speaker that the Islamists didn't disagree with. Now, it may be that the speaker was an extremist or not, or had said problematic things or not. That's irrelevant. The fact is that that speaker was allowed to come into the UK and to, speak. So it's not for anyone else to decide what a Hindu temple can do or not do, or if it is a matter of opposing it, then they can do it lawfully. But that's not what happened in Smethwick. What they did do was they targeted the Hindu temple, and we heard anti-Hindu sentiments both in Leicester and in Smethwick against Hindus. So this wasn't a case of we're rejecting this speaker in Smethwick. This was a case of we're actually rejecting Hindus in Smethwick for bringing in this speaker. So those are some important things that were happening. Also, the Islamist elements coming from outside of Leicester, So they were coming from London, coming from Birmingham. Now, London is obviously the capital. So we had Islamists coming from there all the way up to Leicester, over 100 miles away. And then Birmingham is in the West Midlands, and they were coming from there to Leicester. And now the only reason why they were coming is because they were well organized. They were well organized because there was a threat that they believed was against them, or even if they didn't believe that, they manufactured this threat in order to obviously feel like they could do something about it and to garner support. Now, this is really important when we really think about this, because when these Islamists came, the language that they were using was language of self-defense. They said that we're at threat. They said that the Hindutva are out here trying to get us. We heard some awful anti-Hindu sentiments being made against this, and they even said in front of the police that, you know, if these people try to do anything, we're going to lawfully resist them using proportional force. What they're trying to do is use the language of law to get away with actually carrying out acts of violence against Hindus. And so this is quite smart on their part, okay, because what they're trying to do is present themselves as being under attack. And if therefore we carry out violence, then that means it's lawful because we're under attack. And what are we meant to do? We're resisting. This is self-defense. And this is the sort of stuff that was happening. But it wasn't just this, because if I go back to your original question, is what really happened? Well, what also really happened is that the media played a role in this as well. There were some mainstream media outlets who were very much on this apparent Hindutva threat. I do put this as a caveat because there might be a threat, there might not be. I need to see the evidence, and so I can verify it myself. In fact, that's in my view, a Islamic principle is whenever someone brings a claim to you, then show me the proof, the evidence, and prove your claim. And so I haven't seen that yet. And when I'm presented with it, I will make my assessment of it. But at the time, there was such a focus on the so-called Hindutva threat that mainstream media seemed to ignore the threat or the act threat of Islamists. Now, as I said before, the police confirmed that none of this stuff against Muslims seemed to be happening. So the kidnapping, the stabbings, you know, all that sort of stuff. But it was so obvious, blatantly, that there were threats being made against Hindus, actual anti-Hindu hatred, bigotry taking place when people are climbing onto temples and taking down the saffron flag, and then also rude gestures being made at another temple in Smethwick. Now, one mainstream media newspaper focused so much on Hindutva threat that in all of their coverage of the Leicester riots, they mentioned Hindutva 13 times, whereas they only mentioned Islamism once. And to me, I think that's quite bizarre when it's quite demonstrable what's taking place, yet at the same time, what was being presented in mainstream outlets was a completely different narrative. But it wasn't just that, it was also a whole article was devoted to explaining what Hindutva was and why it was a threat, yet nothing on Islamism again. And this just seems so odd when we can see blatantly what's happening, yet what we're reading is something completely different. So there's a mainstreaming there of Islamists and a mainstreaming there, or when I say mainstreaming of Islamists, what I mean is a legitimization of Islamists. And then there's also a mainstreaming of the so-called apparent Hindutva threat, which seems to be very bizarre. So, you know, but it's not just that. Some of these media outlets were being, walked around towns, cities such as Leicester, by some of the people who are being accused of stirring up hatred and violence. And again, this just seems so bizarre. Why are, in my view, the leftist media giving platforms to some of these individuals who have praised the Taliban or, you know, praised Al-Qaeda, groups such as that, and then being used as trusted sources for what seems to have been taking place? There was also even accusations of some of these individuals being involved in some of this stuff. So when you ask me, Kamal, what really happened, in my view, a lot was happening, and it seems to be a lot happening against the Hindu community in Leicester and creating this Hindutva bogeyman so that more focus was on that rather than on the Islamists.
Absolutely, Wasiq ji. Thank you so much. I think that was a very comprehensive account of the various dimensions to something like this. Now, in fact, before I actually go to my next question, I wanted to particularly ask you about the whole targeting of Hindutva. Now, one of the strategies that Islamists and a lot of sometimes leftist journalists also use is, like you mentioned, to create a false alarm to almost divert people's attention away from the Islamist threat. And in this case, it was clearly Hindutva. And there also seems to be very concerted effort to vilify the word Hindutva, because if you translate the word, what it actually means is Hindu-ness, right? And it's so normal. I mean, somebody like me sitting in India is very confused. I mean, how is Hindu-ness? How is me being Hindu creating violence in another country? So it's sort of mind-boggling a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? I mean, why is Hindutva now becoming the new target?
Well, I think Hindutva is becoming the target because I think, in my view, it seems to be that so much there has been a lot of focus on Islamism for a number of years now in the UK. So Islamism has gained a lot of attention. So because obviously when we look at the terrorist attacks that have happened since 2005, the 7/7 bombings, where 52 people died and hundreds were injured, this was, by the way, carried out by homegrown terrorists from here. So they were Muslim, they were Islamists, and they turned their back on their country, and they killed their own people. And when I say their own people, I'm not talking here about Muslims. I'm talking here about British people, because when I talk about my own people, I'm talking about the country that I live in, and I don't separate them by their religion or their color or any other kind of identitarian aspect or factor to them. So because there's so much of a threat of Islamism, and the focus to divert it away to something, the Hindutva threat, okay? And so there seems to be that concerted effort. But there's a point here that needs to be made, is that when it comes to the two threats, we need to be clear. We know for certain that there are no terrorist or extremist actions or acts that have been carried out from so-called Hindutva extremists. So I'm just going to use the word or the terms Hindutva extremists. Let's just say, sake of argument, let's just agree that it exists. If it exists, then we will see some sort of data to obviously prove it. But we haven't seen that. But nonetheless, it still exists. Okay, fine. But in comparison then to Islamist extremism, well, let's look at some statistics in terms of Islamist extremism. So from the period between 31st of March 2013 to 31st of March 2021, in terms of people in custody for Islamist extremism connected offences, there were more than any other form of extremism, and will include that Hindutva extremism, even though that comes up as 0. Now, the lowest number of people in custody for Islamist extremism was 79 people in 2014, with an increase of over 100% at 164 in 2017. So in that 3-year period, we saw a 100% rise in Islamist extremists in prison. And then the highest peak came a year later, where it went from 164 all the way to 186 individuals recorded as being in custody for the same connected offense. Now, when we look at, for example, far-right extremism, in the same 9-year period, so that's from 2013 all the way to 2021, there was 1,000% increase in extreme right-wing connected offences. Now, there's a reason why I'm pointing this out, because this is what is going to be employed against Hindutva extremism. So because, and I'll get to this point in a second actually. Now, there's a reason why I'm pointing this out, is because it sounds quite alarming. 1,000% increase in extreme right-wing connected offences, right? But the reality is different. The number of individuals in custody for extreme right-wing connected offences rose from 4 to 44. That's our 1,000% increase. So there are therefore significantly fewer extreme right-wing prisoners in custody than their Islamist counterparts, despite the apparent increase in convictions. So although we've got a statistic there of 1,000% of people going up in terms of extreme right-wing connected offences, in reality, that 44 figure is less than the 79 figure I gave for Islamist extremism. So now, the reason why I make this point is we don't have any extremist or terrorist attacks carried out by extreme or Hindutva extremists, okay? So as soon as we have one or two, or let's say we have one in the period from 2021 to 2022, so that we've got our baseline. In 2022 to 2023, if it goes up to 2, that's already 100%. So media can quite easily say we've got 100% increase in Hindutva extremism. And there you go. You've got your bogeyman there. You've got your threat. Let's start diverting all of our resources, all of our attention to the Hindutva extremism. But for it to be equal to that of the far right, which is at 4 to 44, or that Islamism, which is from 79 all the way to 186, you would need to see so many attacks in such a small space of time to be able to actually say, yeah, it's to the equivalent extent. Actually, no, you're never going to get that in that small space of time, because as far as I can see, given that from migration all the way from World War II, when people from the Indian subcontinent came to Britain, up until today, there hasn't been any of those attacks being taken place by Hindutva extremists. It's not going to happen in the next couple of years, the next 5 years, or the next 10 years. If it does happen, well, then we've got a problem. But I cannot see that that's going to be the case. So when we are thinking about the question that you raised, is why is so much attention being put away from the Islamist threat to the Hindutva threat, is because people want to believe that there isn't an Islamist threat, when actually clearly there is. Especially look at just on connected offences, Islamist extremism, they dominate statistics year on year, and they've been doing it for the last 9 years. I cannot see that it's going to regress anytime soon.
Right. Thanks, Wasiq ji. I think that puts a lot of things in proportion. I think the ratios and proportions are really missing in a lot of media narratives these days, and I mean, and that is why you have such skewed perspectives. We're really talking about different proportions here, and I would say exponentially different proportions. Wasiq ji, you mentioned, I mean, we've been talking about Islamism. I actually wanted to take a step back and ask you about what's been happening in the UK in recent years, because Islamism seems to be increasing in the number of activities across the UK. Can you tell us how they've been able to do this inside of the UK?
Yeah, sure. So I think your viewers would be interested first in understanding what Islamism is and what is an Islamist. I think definitions are really important because they help shape our understanding of what we're talking about. So Islamism essentially is the political idea that the religion of Islam has a role to play, not just in the private sphere, but also in the public one. And it's essentially political Islam. It's not exactly political Islam, but essentially is political Islam. So Islam becomes a political instrument to be used in public. Now, in regards to the private, when we talk about the role Islam or plays in private, this of course concerns Muslims, primarily Muslims. It doesn't concern anyone else. So, as a Muslim myself, I pray 5 times a day. That's a condition that's placed on me by my faith. So I follow that faith. I'm a devout Muslim. That's fine, not a problem. But when we consider the public sphere and the role religion plays in the public, we're now examining how it results in or applies pressure to non-Muslims. So kafir is the Arabic term for non-Muslim or non-believer, and how that then plays in democracies such as the West, or even in Bharat in India. So that's what we're thinking about here. And a person who subscribes to this political ideology of Islamism is known as an Islamist. And an Islamist will have made the conscious decision of political affirmation to the political idea that religion should play a role in public life. And when we think about Islamists, and I think your viewers would be very interested to know this, is that there are three types of Islamists. It's not a homogenous block. They don't, there is some diversity in it. And even within the groups that I do talk about now, there's still a bit more diversity in it. But we don't have a lot of time to go through all of that. So I will give it, let your viewers into who these groups are. So there are three types of groups. There are the violent Islamists, there are the non-violent Islamists, and there are the participationist Islamists. Now, of course, your viewers know very well, not all Muslims are Islamists, but all Islamists are essentially Muslims. Okay, so now the violent Islamists are those who we would consider the Islamist jihadis, the terrorists, the ones who carry out violence in the name of Islam, in the name of their political ideology of Islamism, to further the aim of the revival of Islam within life and the whole world. They want to set up a Sharia ruled by a calendar ruled by Sharia. Then you got the non-violentists who share the same aims, but they don't carry out the violence. Okay, so they might do it through politics, or through the mosque, or through their own groups, and so on and so forth. And then, interestingly, you've got the participationist Islamists. Now, these guys are essentially the ones who use the machinery of democracy, use policies, use law as a way to do this. So they don't engage in violence. They don't necessarily want a caliphate ruled under Sharia. What they do want, though, is to get places to be Sharia compliant as much as possible. So what I mean by that is that secular spaces like schools, they want to be able to implement hijab, not just for Muslims, but if you ask them, they would want everyone else to be wearing it, because they would use this very same secular laws that apply to them, everyone else. That if we have to abide by a uniform code, then why can't you abide by our uniform code? So if, for example, they set up an Islamic school and a non-Muslim joins, they will expect them to also wear the hijab. So they will actually mirror what's going on in secular states such as Bharat, or in the West, and adopt those things. And that's one of the ways for them to Islamicize society. But it's not just that. They also use the laws against you. So they will use minority rights as a way to show their dominance, in other words. So they'll say, look, the hijab is our right to wear, and if you prevent us from wearing it, then you are discriminating us against, against us because we are Muslims. So they attach that same thing. Yet what you don't see necessarily is the same happening with some other religious groups, such as Christians or Jews, particularly in the West, because what they do is they want to present, again, and I go back to this point, they want to present themselves as being under attack, because unless they feel under attack, then they've got no other reason to exist. When we look at the West, for example, the West, we have freedom of speech, we have freedom of religion. You can say what you want, you can believe what you want, and you can also not say what you want and not believe anything you want. You can, almost be whatever you want to be, as long as it's within the law. But that's a problem for Islamists. And one of the ways that they do this, and this is probably quite relevant to some of your viewers in Bharat, is blasphemy laws. So in the West, we don't have blasphemy laws, but in Middle Eastern countries, there is some respect that is afforded to religions, and that's just through the culture that you have. But you do have freedom of speech essentially in a lot of these countries. But in 2008, in the UK, we repealed the blasphemy laws. We no longer have those blasphemy laws. So you can say essentially anything you want about a religion, and no one can actually stop you from doing that. But that's a problem for Islamists because, in my view, they are snowflakes. You say anything about Islam, you say anything about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, anything like that, anything derogatory, then they're up in arms, they're out there screaming and shouting, protesting, and they're also using violence. There was a recently Batley Grammar School, a school for gifted and talented students who would have passed an exam to get to school in the North Yorkshire town of Batley. A teacher there had shown a caricature, a picture of the Prophet Muhammad, and he was subsequently, a student had subsequently told elders of this. And as a result, there were lots of protests then taking place outside of the school. A lot of these protests were very intimidating. On social media, we saw lots of people also saying intimidating things. There were also threats that we saw against this teacher. And this teacher had to go into hiding as a result of showing a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. So let me just put that into context. A teacher had to go into hiding because he had showed a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, this is very bizarre in Western democracies where we have free speech. Now, the question was, how are Islamists using the tools of democracy? Well, in this case, they weren't using the tools of democracy, not per se. Well, they were, first of all, protesting, which they're allowed to do so they don't break the law, but they're not allowed to threaten people. This teacher didn't go into hiding because he wasn't scared. He went into hiding because he was scared. He was frightened for his life, and he's still in hiding almost 2 years later. Now, the reason why he's in hiding is because an Islamic charity had actually published his name. So nobody knew who he was until this Islamic charity had published his name. And they published his name. He's gone into hiding. No one said anything about it. The political elite here was silent on it. The Islamists were gaining traction. They were gaining strength as a result of this. No one was doing anything about it. And he's still in hiding. And this is really, really bizarre, because you would expect that given that we have freedom of speech here and you are allowed to show the Prophet Muhammad, and remember, I say this as a Muslim, a devout Muslim, you can do that. So what? If you're going to get offended by people who object to your religion, then there's something, in my view, there's something really wrong with you. But that was happening, and no one was standing up to it. And what they did essentially is that they made that school Sharia compliant, because now that school will never ever show a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. They will never say anything derogatory about Islam when you're allowed to do both of them. And it's not just that school. Other schools are going to be following the same suit. They will be doing the same thing. They will not be talking or challenging beliefs within Islam. They will not be challenging terrorist attacks that are carried out by Muslims who are Islamists, because if they do, then they could be accused of Islamophobia. They could be at threat or being threatened by some of these Islamists that if you do this, then who knows what could happen to them. So these are the sorts of things or the tactics that these Islamists do. And I think, in fact, when you look at Bharat, for example, there are slogans like Sartan se Jada, which means to chop off the head, to decapitate the head from the body if someone insults the Prophet or insults Islam or anything like that. And this is quite mad, because when you think about it, where are the government in India, and why aren't they pushing back against these Islamists? And I am critical of the government in India, because they should be cracking down on these Islamists, and they shouldn't be not doing it because they can't manage the fallout of it. They should be doing it because they should be able to manage the fallout of it. And if they can't manage the fallout of it, then you're ceding ground to the Islamists. They're getting stronger because they know, actually, do you know what, the let's say the BJP-led government aren't doing anything about it. I think only a few months ago, a tailor was, hacked to death by two Islamists. Because he had shown support to a politician who had said something, or not even a politician, I think it was just a spokesperson, who had said something that lots of Islamists found, objectionable. And this is quite crazy. This is the situation that we're in, that Islamists are essentially running the roost, and the political elite aren't seemingly able to do anything about it.
Absolutely, Wasiqji. I think, you'd be shocked to know that there were actually more people after that who were killed for the same reason. It's just that this one case was all over in the news because the killers actually took a video of this. But then for the same reason, you had others also being killed. And this is a big problem in India because, one is, of course, like you mentioned, dominating public spaces that Islamists do. But you also have a section of Islamists who, like you said, are violent, and they would go to any extent to enforce this. And in India, even if the law is sort of equal, sometimes it isn't. It's skewed towards Islamists. But even if it were equal, there is still this thing that we call in India as the street veto. That Islamists have a veto on the street, which nobody else can match, and that's not a level playing field, right? And like you mentioned, we see this all around us because even in the movie industry in India, you are allowed to show certain religions in a particular way, but you're not allowed to make fun of, let's say, Islam. And that's also applicable for stand-up comedians, a whole range of things, right? So it's a very interesting point, and I think something that is worth thinking about why this happens and why there is a lopsided sort of an approach that there is to this issue. Now, you a few weeks ago, Wasiqji, had written a piece. Now, again, going back to Leicester, but more generally as well, about how it was ignored, by the media and also the authorities in general. Now, but this, like you mentioned, goes well beyond just Leicester, or even the UK for that matter. This is, you can see similar patterns across the world now. Why does it happen that the media and the public discourse so almost, it seems, very deliberately ignores this? Why do they do this?
Well, in my view, Kamal Bhai, is I think that there is a bigotry of low expectations that seems to be enforced onto the diverse Muslim community in Britain. And what I mean by this is that if you focus on Islamism, these people, whether it's the media, whether it's politicians who are sympathetic to Islamists, they seem to think that if you focus on Islamism, then somehow you are focusing on Muslims and Islam, when that's clearly not the case. It's so far from the truth. There are two caveats here, or statements of fact. Islam is a religion, whereas Islamism is a political ideology. So I always say this because I'm not going to conflate the two, and I think anyone in Bharat conflates the two, or anyone in the West conflates the two. The only people who conflate the two are the Islamists themselves. They want us to believe that Islamism is Islam and Islamists are Muslims, and of course, that's further from the truth. In terms of Islamism and Islam, they are not the same. Islamists can be Muslims, but not all Muslims are Islamists. So that's really, really important. Now, it's a bigotry of low expectations to assume, first of all, if you tackle Islamism, then Muslims are going to be attacked. Actually, no, that's not the case. When we think about some of the things that have been happening as a result of Islamists, it's Muslims who are actually pushing back against this. For example, particularly your viewers in Bharat who don't know about our de-radicalization program known as Prevent. Now, this is one strand of our counter-terrorism measure known as Channel. Now, it is designed to, as the title says, prevent people from being radicalized into extremists or being able to carry out acts of terrorism. Now, it's not only for Muslims, it's not only for Christians, it's for anyone and everyone. Anyone who is potentially able to be radicalized, Prevent is the help prevent them from that happening. But these Islamists, they want to obviously paint a picture that Prevent itself is Islamophobic. It's inherently Islamophobic, and I put Islamophobic into quotation marks, and I can come onto that later, why that's a problematic term in and of itself. But they do that because they think that if you target Islamists, then you're targeting Muslims. They want you to conflate that, and this idea gives credence that any attack that is carried out by a Muslim is in the name of Islam, then neither his religious identity nor the religion should be mentioned as a result of this. Because if you do this, then it's Muslims who will be vilified. It's Islam that will be vilified. Look, I've already said before that Islam can be critiqued, especially in the West, because we have free religion, we have freedom of speech. Muslims as a block, a diverse block, should not be critiqued, just like Hindus as a diverse block should not be critiqued, because you cannot create a whole group of people. If you do that, then you venture into the territory of anti-Muslim bigotry or anti-Hindu bigotry. So you don't do things like that. What you do, however, is you critique those people who seek to use the Muslim identity as a shield to protect them against any kind of scrutiny that they are subjected to as a result of any illegal or unlawful behavior that they carry out, such as extremism or terrorism or violence against Hindus in the case of Leicester. And so it's being ignored because there is an imagined victim. We're thinking of imagined victims here. So the whole of the Muslim community will be a victim if you go and focus on Islam. And this shouldn't be the case. Now, let's say, for example, there is an issue of Hindutva extremism, and we do find that that is the case. We're not going to start saying, right, we're not going to deal with Hindutva extremism, because if we deal with Hindutva extremism, Hindus are going to be victims. How are they going to be victims? We're protecting Hindus if we are focusing on the threat of Hindutva extremism. And it's the same then with Muslims. So we're protecting Muslims if we focus on the Islamist threat. But they want it to be the other way around. If we focus on the Islamist threat, then we're making Muslims into victims. That's not the case. And this is the cognitive dissonance that we're facing here in the West. And potentially you might be facing there in Bharat.
Absolutely, we do, and I think it's really mind-boggling sometimes, because it's a very clear hypocrisy. It's cognitive dissonance at play all the time, and politicians do it as well. Besides the media, of course, and I guess they have their own reasons. And here, of course, there's this whole practice of vote bank politics, because they view Muslim community as a vote bank and would like to have their support, and therefore they indulge in things like this. They brush issues completely under the carpet. How is it? How is it different? In the way politicians approach this compared to the media. Do they have, like I said, reasons of electoral politics, or how is it in the UK?
Well, obviously, Muslims here in the UK, in the West, they are eligible to vote just like any other citizen, and so and because they are sometimes in communities, you find a big community of Muslims, and sometimes you might go to an area and there's a small community of Muslims, but there are communities of Muslims, and they're diverse. And if politicians can infiltrate some of those communities communities and they will do that. And one of the ways that they do that is using community conduits. So a conduit would be the person, a spokesperson, a bridge between the community and the politician. And this is, in my view, this is quite crazy, because this idea of a conduit is very, very problematic. It's so problematic that when it came to the grooming gang cases, now some of your viewers might not know what the grooming gang case is during the late 90s and up to at least the mid up to at least 2010, 2013 in fact, there were cases of white underage girls being industrially raped by men predominantly of Pakistani origin. So British Pakistani men in groups who are known as grooming gangs were grooming white underage girls to obviously to rape these girls and to use them for their own nefarious needs and wants. And obviously this is really wrong, because it's, first of all, it's rape, it's underage, so there's an aspect of pedophilia there to that. There's also the predatory aspect to that. So they see some of these girls as dirty and filthy because they might not be brown, or they might not be Pakistani, or they might not be Muslim. Whatever reasons are, they targeted these girls. Okay, now this is very specific. These grooming gangs, they're not the same as are the predominant perpetrators of this sort of crime, who are white men. But we do have a problem of grooming gangs made up of British Pakistani men, and it should be called out. And it was being called out. And Kamal Bhai, the people who were calling it out, you wouldn't even believe it because you don't hear it that often, was women within the British Pakistani community. They were calling it out. They were standing up against the men in their own community who were carrying out these crimes. Now, these people were their brothers, their uncles, their fathers, their husbands. They were standing up against them and saying, what you're doing is wrong. But the problem was that there was a community conduit between them and the local authority, the councils, the police force, the politicians. And so they were being ignored. Now, this is why it's problematic, because when you have these so-called community leaders who act as a conduit between the community and politicians or the local authority, crimes like this go unchallenged. And when they go unchallenged, then political leaders will see that actually we can probably get away with it so long as we can get these guys to just vote for us. And I don't have any evidence that that is the case, but I'd be very surprised if that wasn't the case. The Alexis J report that looked into this highlighted this very clearly, that Muslim women within the community, Pakistani Muslim women in the community, stood up against these people, against the perpetrator in their own community, but they were ignored. And this is terrible. And it's the same with Islamists. We see that, again, the same tactic. Islamists want to be the conduit between the diverse Muslim community with the politicians and local authorities. And the message I always say to British Muslims or any Muslim here in the UK is that, look, just like every other citizen of the UK, whether you're Hindu, whether you're Sikh, Christian, or of no faith, you have the same rights as everyone else. You do not need these community leaders to speak on your behalf. You can speak on your behalf. You can go straight to your politician and tell them about any problems that you're having, or any successes that you have, or whatever it is that you want. You do not need a spokesperson or a spokesman. And I probably should emphasize, it's usually men who are doing this, spokesmen on your behalf. You should be British, you should be Muslim, and you should be able to say what you believe rather than have someone else say it. And the reasons why Islamists get so far is because we already have this culture of these community leaders, these religious community leaders, or cultural community leaders, or national community, whatever it is. We have those, and they are problematic because they are not here to speak on behalf of any community. A diverse community, let alone any person as an individual themselves.
No, absolutely, Wasiq. And I think uh, just as you mentioned in the case of UK, I think even in India, Indian Muslims are often fed with narratives of oppression, and to create a kind of a siege mentality, that you're always under siege, and that is again exploited by politicians. So I think it's very important to realize that one doesn't need somebody else to talk for you. You can speak up for yourself, and also evaluate and assess things on your own terms, uh, instead of sort of taking somebody else's word for it. um, and that actually brings me to something that I wanted to ask you, which is, I really wanted you to give out a message to young people in India, because often they shy away from talking about issues like these, particularly Islamism, for similar reasons that you mentioned, right? Because they feel that this might offend somebody's sentiments, especially the Muslim community, and even Muslims themselves don't like to talk about it because they think they might actually, helping their enemies, who have been constructed in their minds. So, what would you tell Indians in particular? Because clearly a lot of these problems cut across national boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the issues that we face here in the West are transnational, and we see a lot of these issues in Bharat. We see them in the Middle East, and we see them in some other Western countries. And my message, I guess, to young people in Bharat is that sunlight is the best disinfectant against Islamists. They want to drag us to the dark ages, and they will do this by claiming that they should not be offended. And so they're putting their right of not being offended over the right of you, not necessarily offending them, of you having any say on anything. Okay. So even if you were to offend them, that's a problem for them. And even if you weren't to offend them, that's still a problem for them. So you're stuck. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I tell you what, in terms of Islamists, this is pathetic. They are pathetic themselves. That they're such snowflakes that you say anything about them, or Islamism or Islamists, or the attacks carried out by that they get so offended that they have to resort to violence to stop you from saying that. Just think about how pathetic that is. And so the young people in Bharat, and I say this both to Hindu young people, to Sikh, to atheists, and particularly to Muslims in Bharat, because they are your citizens. That they consider that to be their home, and this is the majority of them. That actually you're on the winning side, because if someone has to resort to violence to stop you from speaking, then you're probably speaking something really good, and you're probably speaking something that is right, and you're calling them out, and they need to be called out. You need to, whether it's in Bharat or in the West, we need to put onto that platform, and we need to be able to challenge them. Because by being able to challenge them on a free speech platform, you take away the power that they have, because the only power that they have is either cancel you. Particularly, we have this problem here in the West, but they're in Bharat, they're going to use violence. They're going to try and chop off your head. Only recently, the who was killed, um, he wasn't the first and he wasn't the last. There's loads, and it happens all the time. And then you see them chanting out, Sultan Jada in their droves all the, and no one's pushing back against them. And that needs to be pushed back. You don't need to engage in that situation there when they're out there doing that. No, go onto media and call them out. The media in Bharat will give you that platform, and I'm sure that they would be more than happy to have Indian Muslims on media calling out these Islamists, because that's what we don't see at the moment enough of. We need to see more of that, because at the end of the day, Indian Muslims are no different to Indian Hindus, or Indian Sikhs, or Christians. They all want the same They want to live a more peaceful life. They just want to get on with, with their lives. They don't want any trouble, but the Islamists are causing trouble. And at the end of the day, someone's going to need to stand up, and we need to rely on our young people to be able to stand up to this. And you can stand up to it using the tools of democracy, using a platform of free speech, using the media to your advantage against guys. Because if the politicians aren't going to pay attention to this issue enough, then it needs to be up to their constituents to do that. And you can pressure your politicians to then do that. So there's lots of ways to do that. So, my message is to all of the young people and everyone, in fact, in Bharat, is don't lose hope against these Islamists. They can't do anything unless you do something back to them. Okay, and that doesn't mean that you have to break the law. That doesn't mean to cause violence. That means you have to stay true to the constitution of Bharat, true to the constitution, or the values that you hold dear to yourself that don't align with these Islamists. And you can beat them, and you will beat them. You have to believe that you beat them, because if you don't believe that you can beat them, then the Islamists are winning. And then I would then say, actually, do you know what? You guys are pathetic. But I don't believe that that's the case. I believe that the citizens of Bharat, the citizens of the West, are standing up to them. And the fact that Kamal Bhai, we're talking about this so openly, so freely, just shows that actually that fight back has started, and it started strong.
Absolutely, Wasiq ji. That's a fantastic message, I think, to conclude this conversation, because it's so important to speak up at the end of the day, and realize the importance of doing that. Because if we don't do that, then the Islamists succeed in carrying out the agenda that they want to, and it's good for everybody, no matter which community you're coming from, that you speak up and speak up freely about these issues. Thank you so much, Wasiq ji. This has been a very enriching conversation with you. I think our viewers are taking away many different concepts and nuances, and also understand and equip themselves to approach issues like these from a very logical and systematic manner. And thank you for sharing all of those insights with us.
No problem.
Thank you, Wasiq ji. And viewers, please let us know what you think. And if you have questions or comments, please do leave them in the comment section. And we'd love to hear from you what you think. And we'll see you again in another such insightful conversation. Take care. Namaste.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.